it's appropriately titled How Google Works. Pretty much.
As opposed to how the alphabet works.
Right, exactly. I would think that How Google Works book would be a little bit larger than this one. There's a lot to talk about.
I know. Well, it would have to be consumable.
So, we were talking a little bit before we walked up on stage here, and I asked you how often you're in China, and you're in China at least once a year.
And I've been coming here for many years. My first visit was more than 20 years ago. And the sort of rate of transformation is just hard to describe. And since you see it up top, you see the transformation every time.
So you were saying back in 1995, it was just a different landscape. The cityscape was different. The amount of vehicles were different. The streets were different. As far as technology goes, what stands out to you as, let's say, in the last 2 decades, the most important transformation in China, mainland China?
When I first came here, Sun had a subsidiary that was selling Sun computers to the universities here, including to Tsinghua. And my first experiences were with Tsinghua University doing research on Sun computers. And the internet had just arrived. And by far the biggest transformation of the country has been the rise of mobile mobility. And now the Chinese mobile companies, the sort of roughly 4 companies, are, by any measure, the largest network, the largest number of users, the largest service providers. And when they talk about the number of customers they have, it's like 1 billion customers, and they talk about covering the entire country all the way into the mountains and so forth and so on. And the country was relatively slow to issue LTE licenses, but now quickly LTE has taken over, and the benefits of it is enormous in this country.
When I landed here in Beijing yesterday, coming from San Francisco in the U.S., there was a lot of talk of, okay, well, what services are going to work that we use regularly and what services don't work, and what are some of the workarounds for us to do our job. The situation with Google has obviously changed over the last 6 years. Can you tell us any more about what Google is working on in China to become more of a search presence than it has decided not to be in the last 6 years?
You know, it's interesting that Google never left China, and we continue to have more than 500 employees here with lots of partners, huge Android presence.
You have offices in Beijing and Shanghai.
And also in Greater China, in Taiwan and Hong Kong. And much of the servers are done outside of Hong Kong. So from our perspective, we very much like to serve all of China. And we continue to sort of chat with the government about all of this.
Is that why you're here this week?
We're always talking to the government. They've also visited us in California as well. And so that's one of the reasons for not being here. What's interesting to me about China is the level of entrepreneurialism, which of course this conference represents, is probably the highest, or very close to the highest in the world. And if you look at where do you get the kind of diversity of innovation, you get it in Silicon Valley, you get it a little bit in Boston, you get it in Tel Aviv, and you get it in Beijing, Shanghai. And I, along with many other people, thought that the level of innovation and science and so forth here would take much longer to achieve. So just as impressive as the shift from bicycles, which was on the first ring road and now it's full of cars, the other shift has been the rise in investment in educational systems here at the university level. And what I understand is that the Chinese government is pouring money into high-end research universities in computer science, engineering, genetics, the sort of hardcore stuff. And that bodes very well for the country.
In the last 5 years, the concept of mobile first has really changed. Even just 5 years ago, the folks that were saying, well, it won't be long before that's all we're doing. And a lot of us thought, everything is so clunky on mobile, it's so much harder to do what you need to do. That's no longer the case. What do you see changing in that same vein over the next 5 to 10 years?
It's worth actually thinking, when was it that when your smartphone took over your life? And I'll give you an example. Watch a movie from 2007, 2008, before the iPhone was introduced, and they'll be referring to things called PDAs, and they might refer to a BlackBerry and things like that. But with the arrival of the iPhone, and shortly thereafter, Android One and then its successors, we've seen billions of people, almost 2 billion people using smartphones or one kind or another. And with the second version of iOS, I was on the board at the time, the adoption of interfaces which allow for app stores and so forth, which led to another wave of startups. And again, here in China, the average Chinese person doesn't really remember a time before they had access to WeChat. And of course, before that, they had something called Weibo, but they didn't remember before they had that. So when these network-based systems hit, they hit in a broad level, and they really do change society. The next one, of course, is the various on-demand services. In China, there's a leader, two companies just merged called Didi, and of course there's Uber in the rest of the world, Uber here as well. We saw driving around, we saw the Amazon delivery carts, little mopeds, things like that. So it's happening very quickly. It's important to remember that 10 years ago, this was largely an unbanked place, and that everybody had to do business by wiring money. Today they have the equivalent of Alipay and those sorts of things, all indexed by their WeChat accounts.
And yeah, what are your thoughts on the concept of WeChat and other services that want to be, it starts as a messenger, but it's really a way to do all sorts of transactions, business, shopping, the whole nine within that messaging app?
Well, if you look at China and you ask, what are some of the things that China has invented that are likely to export out of China and have a big impact? One of the most obvious is the success of the drone company DJI, which I think is a well understood, hugely successful startup. Google has recently done a deal with Huawei for the latest Nexus 6, and Huawei, after many years, has really come out with an extraordinary set of mobile phones in the product line. And again, I'm hearing anecdotally more and more of that. So those are some examples. I think on the softer side, WeChat is the most interesting because it solves simultaneously many problems that consumers have. And one of the questions I always ask is, why did that product not get invented anywhere else? And I think the answer has to do with the maturity of the banking system, the identification system, the way distribution worked, and that the integrated services of WeChat were not as important, for example, in the US, but they were critically important here. So they were invented here. And I think it's an open question whether those will export, and I think in one form or another they will.
You mentioned DJI. I know that you own your own drone enthusiast, if you will, flight in general enthusiast. What are your thoughts on drone-based deliveries and the concept that it won't be long before, once there are FAA regulations and other regulations to sort out around the world, that's a viable way to do business and delivery?
It makes sense in cities that the only space that's not crowded is above you. And many of you, I suspect, have spent a fair amount of time in the Asian cities. And with the enormous amount of movement from rural to urban, the infrastructure in these cities has not kept up. And in the United States and in Europe, people complain about this, but you see it in the construction of these cities, in the crowded and the metering of transport and so forth and so on. So I think we will clearly see various forms of autonomous delivery and eventually human delivery, that is literally human transportation.
Via drone?
In the equivalent of drones as the technology gets better. And one of the ways to think about it is that in our industry as a whole, the biggest news is around machine learning. And in computer science, the most important thing that has occurred is the development of vision systems that are better than humans. So it is an absolute fact that computers can now see better than humans can. And so many things which are vision intensive are likely to be computer assisted or computer replaced. The most obvious being cars, right? Because cars is largely a vision problem, seeing and avoiding, seeing and turning. I want to go here, I want to go there. All of that should be automated. Google, of course, has a project there, but you can imagine eventually the drone will be automated as well for the same purpose.
So this whole idea, certainly in Silicon Valley, people get very excited when they see one of the Google cars driving down the highway with well, there has to be somebody behind the wheel, but basically driving itself. Is the idea of autonomous cars on land, on the earth, sort of a stopgap solution before we all just rise above?
Well, the helicopter problem, gyrocopter problem, is really a power to weight ratio problem. And there are many, many people who believe that in our lifetimes there will be very inexpensive, very powerful lift systems that we use, various forms of copter and battery systems, and the batteries are getting better. I think that's a matter of conjecture, and I suspect it's true. self-driving cars are technically possible now, and there are all sorts of interesting problems. A typical example is I've been in them, and they are fantastic, and they drive very well, and they're very, very safe. They also drive at the speed limit. So I don't know about you all, but I find myself on the freeway, and I always look around, and I realize that I'm driving a little bit faster than the speed limit, and I'm in the slow lane. So how do you handle that from a regulatory perspective? Do you have a button that says, take me faster than the speed limit? Is that legal? Well, the speed limit is binding, it's not optional. So those are the kinds of issues that have to get resolved before you see this broadly throughout the world.
I know 5 years ago, the conversation was so much about how is mobile going to become a solution that we can all use. How can we use the computer here in our pockets as our personal.
Yeah, and think of it as a supercomputer. It's literally a supercomputer. The computation capability of this next generation Snapdragon chips and the iPhone proprietary rivals any supercomputer that we had 10 years ago. It's extraordinary.
I know Google is one of many companies that's heavily invested in machine learning and the idea that your computer can know more about you over time based on your habits, based on the things that you do, the people you talk to, the things that you search for. Right now, I do a lot of, well, let's compare Siri to Google Now when I ask a query. And Google Now is almost always across the board just able to understand my language better. But that's really just the first step. Can you understand what I'm saying in this particular language? What can we look forward to, or what are you looking forward to that conceptually maybe we haven't even grasped yet about machine learning?
Well, I think it's, today when you use Google Translate, you're using machine learning from Google, and it does not use a dictionary. It uses a mathematical technique called deep learning, where it understands the concept, basically the structure of phonemes, and translates them into chunks. The chunks are then assembled into words, into sentences, and then they're translated into impossibly interestingly different paragraphs in the other language. And we have done demos where you can actually do this in real time. So you can actually talk into your phone and it comes out in another language. So I think that problem is a pretty well understood problem. I think in the next 5 or 10 years, people will have forgotten the big problems in those areas. But that is an extraordinary technological feat. The question is how much farther do you go from that sort of relatively straightforward translation to real understanding? And my argument would be that computers are very good at rote pattern recognition. So we can probably mimic human behavior if it's routine and predictable and
not riddled with sarcasm.
Yeah, sort of normal things. So sitting there and monitoring something, or keeping your eye on something, or giving you an alert for something, or watching for a pattern. It becomes more and more speculative the farther you go down. Now, we're not talking about consciousness now here, we're not talking about writing Shakespeare, but there are demonstrations today in the industry where computers can write reasonably good college-level papers. Right? So that's an example where it's almost human. And in the industry, there's a large debate as to how much farther they go. Many people I know believe that in 15 or 20 years, it would be possible to have cognition at the level of real cognitive thought on a human basis. But I would argue that that's speculation at this point. We don't know. It's possible. It's also possible that we'll get other robots.
These are the sorts of things